Did you all catch some of the gospel in hearing that different people that came to Jesus? We have the Syrophoenician woman, and we have the the deaf man. How many of you know who a Syrophoenician woman is? So a Syrophoenician woman would have been someone who would have been sort of from northern, what we would know as northern Syria, and likely Greek, maybe Canaanite, and someone who would not have been from Jesus' culture or the apostles' culture. And she approaches Jesus, and there's this sort of strange moment where she begs for her daughter to be healed, and Jesus' response is what? Well, even the dogs can get the crumbs off the table. Doesn't that seem strange to you? Doesn't that seem like a strange response from Jesus? And I think it does for me, because it's not usually what we sort of get from him, but we get this sort of unusual response. And the scholars diving into this think that Jesus is not really talking to her, he's talking to everyone who's listening. In other words, the story is being told for those who are hearing it to understand that God's grace, God's love, is far beyond anything within a narrow definition of who could receive it. I think that's an important thing to hold on to for just a second. What about that rich text from James? Who do you welcome into your assembly? Who do you welcome into your thing? If you allow someone who has fine gold and great robes to come in and yet ignore the poor or the person who is not dressed appropriately, do you really get what God is saying? And then towards the end of James, these powerful words about if you have faith but don't have the works that go along with it, you're sort of missing the point. Now, a lot of times, how many of you grew up with parents who told you that you got stars on your crowns in heaven when you were a good boy or a good girl, or something along those lines? Anybody ever, my dad, when he would sit down with me and we'd pray, he'd talk about, well, what stars did you get your crown, Gar? And then what stars got taken away today? And I talked to Dad about this a while back, and he says, I don't know how to be a dad. And I was like, Dad, that's works righteousness, and it's a fallacy, and it's theologically inappropriate. And he looked at me like, well, it worked. But I think it's kind of interesting, right? We do that if you think about it, right? We think about I was good, so we think about our reward. And I was bad, and we think about what's taken away. And that's really not what James is talking about, right? The idea that often gets confused is the love that God gives to us, or God's grace. And that's available and free, and it's not something we earn. Does that make sense? Nothing you can do will earn God's grace. It's just simply given to you. And our faith, our belief, if you listen to what Jesus has to say, has this moment where it's supposed to line up with our behavior. In other words, what we believe, what we say, what we do is supposed to line up with how we act and how we go about our life. Think back for just a minute in your own life about people who really lived as an example of someone who lived out their faith. Think about the person in your life that you felt got that James text more than anybody else, that really understood that what they believed and what they said and how they prayed and the scriptures they read on Sunday and the way they went about their life, all of that lined up with how they did their business and how they treated other people and how they acted and what they said and how they behaved. Are any of them perfect? Probably not. Did you know some that lived up mostly? Probably a lot. We might have known someone who really got it, or we might have known someone that got it sort of, or we might have known someone who was, all these things, or we might be picking people that, we don't really know but are emblems of our faith. But I think if we're really honest about it, we all strive for that, don't we? We strive to line those things up. And I think it's harder than we think. Jesus is there with the Syrophoenician woman. He doesn't ask her to convert. He doesn't really ask her to change. He doesn't really say, you have to do this in order to get this. He just simply has a conversation with her, and her daughter is made well. With the deaf man, he comes and he begs and he asks for Jesus to open his ears, and Jesus responds with that love and with that care. What if we see this in our own spiritual journey of who we are and how God does that work in us, wherever we are and whoever we are at this moment, and that God will reach into us and to heal us? Maybe we're the Syrophoenician woman. Maybe we're the deaf man. Maybe we're broken in any number of other ways. Maybe we're the one who's outside. Maybe we're all the poor in the text from James, seeking Jesus. And then once we find that, how do we take our faith out into the world? How are we able to turn away from that idea that we would turn only to the wealthy, or only to the finely dressed, or only to the important, or only to the powerful, and instead live the gospel values in our life? I think if we dig deep into the baptismal covenant, when we have those baptisms, we make those promises. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons and love your neighbor as yourself? Will you strive for justice and peace among all people? Will you respect the dignity of those around you? Will you break the bread and continue in the prayers? Will you? Will you? It's when we seek to do that in our daily life that the faith that we have in our hearts and our minds and our souls becomes real in the work that we do around us. Last week I got a great chance to go home to El Dorado, and I got to see some of the people who were the leaders of my faith community when I was a little kid. I got to snap a little picture with my children's church leader, Mrs. Amond. I always got in trouble, just so you know. That's a whole nother story for another time. I was so bad my dad had to teach Sunday school. I'm just going to get it out there. They recruited him to teach because they needed me to behave. That was the whole story. I've been told that every time I go back. I'm told that. And then they say, guess what they say? They say, I can't believe you're the one out of all those kids that were coming then that became the priest. So it's just kind of funny. But I got to see Mrs. Amond, and I was thinking about other people, Mrs. White and others that I got to see, that live that text of James out to the best of their ability. And I hardly knew it when I was first around them. But then later in their life, as I got to know them and understand the breadth of how they live their life, I got to see it in different ways. Don't we sometimes make this too hard? Don't we sometimes not really approach it with the depth that we could? So here's the challenge I want you to try to do this week. I want you to take that passage from James home with you. You can take the bulletin with you if you don't know the numbers. Take it with you and pray over it and read it and think about how you act in your life, how you pay attention to the way that your faith and your works line up. And be willing to ask yourself that hard question: am I living out my faith in my works as God would have me to do? But remember that we're all the Syrophoenician woman. We're all the deaf man. We're all the imperfect, broken people whom God has loved so much and given us so much grace. And God is just waiting for us to respond. Amen.